Henry VIII's reign was marked by power, wealth, and prestige, but his last days were far from glorious. Let's dive into the grossest details of the Monster King's death. By the winter of 1547, King Henry VIII of England was nothing more than a hollow shell of his former powerful self. The man who once dominated Europe through politics and war was now completely crippled by disease, depression, and unstoppable bodily decay. They knew, according to Tudor law, it was forbidden to discuss the king's mortality, so they tiptoed around him. In his delirium, he wandered the palace grounds aimlessly, sat alone for hours on end staring into space, and talked to himself. According to reports, Henry's nurse noticed that the king seemed deeply troubled by something on New Year's Day of 1547, as if he had a premonition of his own death. She described the circumstances of the king's passing, emphasizing his belief in Christ and the hope of resurrection. What would be done with the massive, rotting corpse of a king? Next, the intestines and other organs were removed and placed inside a leaden chamber pot. These were then thrown into the privy, sealed with wax, and sunk into the moat. There they remain to this day, encased in solid stone beneath the choir at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more content. What remained of Henry's body was thoroughly washed with wine and water and dressed in his finest clothes. According to an eyewitness, the linen used for the shroud had to be stretched out over the king's gigantic form, like a tent over a camp. Then the entire body was slathered with a mixture of wax and resin. To prevent decomposition, hot wax was poured over the king's face until it hardened into a mask-like barrier. Finally, the body was sewn up in multiple layers of linen and placed in a lead coffin lined with velvet and silk. All in all, this took 20 men 2 days to complete. Henry's doctors estimated his weight at over 300 pounds, and after months of gangrenous decay, his leg was now completely rotten and foul-smelling. However, Henry's immense bulk strained the lead coffin seams, which eventually split open, allowing the smell of decay to waft out. The leak grew steadily worse, and by the time the funeral procession arrived at the castle, the coffin had split open along the sides and bottom, spewing forth its foul contents. Most gruesomely, a red-hot musket ball was fired, causing blood to squirt out of the wound in the king's chest. To make matters even more grotesque, a small dog stuck its head in the opening and began lapping up the king's blood and brains. An eyewitness later wrote that the dog, having drunk his fill, came out and shook himself like a cat and then ran away. But another dog soon came running and did the same thing. It seems the stench of death and decay was too enticing for these poor canines. As the new king was Edward VI, Henry's sons, the family needed to recover the body for proper burial. According to royal protocol, the corpse had to be embalmed and displayed to show that the monarch had died peacefully in his bed, and to demonstrate that the new king had inherited a healthy kingdom from his father. Parliament then proclaimed Edward VI king, beginning the process of transferring power. That evening, he ate a hearty supper with his usual appetite, but soon afterwards began vomiting violently and violently purged his bowels. Still, there was no fever and his temperature was normal, which confused the doctors attending him, and avoided talking about his illness, lest they incur the wrath of Henry or his counselors. Those close to him were terrified because Henry was unpredictable and might strike them down if they upset him, but beneath the fear, everyone was jockeying for position. Many hoped that Prince Edward, Henry's son with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, would ascend to the throne, while others supported Lady Jane Grey, a young woman groomed for kingship by Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Parr. The uncertainty created a tense atmosphere of fear and caution in the court and household, as everyone waited for Henry to die and the next stage of power struggle to begin. His legs were covered in ulcerated, festering wounds that refused to heal after over a decade and had turned him into a walking corpse. He couldn't walk without collapsing or being lifted up by 4 men. But later that morning, his condition worsened. He called for his wife, Catherine Parr, and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, head of the Church of England, to come to his bedside. At this point, the king was unable to speak, except in faint whispers, and responded weakly to questions about his soul and salvation. Cranmer reportedly read passages from the Gospels and asked Henry if he believed the account of Christ's resurrection, to which the king gave a faint sign of assent. Shortly after this, Henry's eyes lost focus, and he appeared to fall into a deep slumber. Catherine Parr stayed at his side for several hours, but when it became clear he wouldn't rouse, she left to rest in her own chambers. Upon waking, she returned to the king, but he had already passed away sometime in the early hours of January. When he slept, he sweated profusely, often dying on the bedsheets. His stomach was distended and hard from years of eating too much and not exercising enough, while his face was gaunt and sallow from blood poisoning and sickness. Even worse, his moods fluctuated wildly from manic euphoria to deep melancholy, and he was prone to fits of rage that made courtiers fear for their lives. Henry was in terrible shape and his body was falling apart. Yet he still acted like the ruthless tyrant he always had been until his eventual demise in January of 1547 at the age of 55. let's explore how the most notorious king in English history met his demise. First, let's take a look at what was ailing him. After he fell off his horse during a jousting match in 1536, the king's leg was severely injured. He tried to ride anyway, but fell again, worsening the wound. While the break itself healed, the skin and muscle did not, causing the wound to turn gangrenous and black. For years, Henry tried everything to fix it, from leeching to the application of rose water and honey, but as time passed, his leg grew ever weaker and more infected, while his overall health deteriorated significantly. Henry developed chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and his belly swelled like a pregnant woman from eating too much. Many believe he also had diabetes, as evidenced by his incessant thirst and urination, and he definitely suffered from gout, a condition marked by excruciating pain and inflammation of the joints. On top of that, Henry suffered periodic bouts of melancholia and paranoia, during which he would pace frantically around the palace and talk for hours without stopping. Towards the end, he would have violent mood swings and lash out at attendants if he didn't like something. So physically and mentally, the king was disintegrating and becoming increasingly erratic as the year 1546 came to an end. As Henry's health faded, those around him raced to secure power in anticipation of the inevitable succession crisis. Meanwhile, the king himself was largely unaware of the scheming and plotting going on around him. In January, Henry woke up feeling weak and unwell, but summoned his 6 chief counselors to question them about certain matters of the realm, indicating that he still had some grasp on royal business. When news of Henry's death reached Parliament, they assembled to hear the proclamation from the chief mourner, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Now, the death of such a powerful monarch raised complex issues regarding his remains. The first step was washing the body, which was done by 4 men using warm water, wine, and various spices. But the work was far from over. The coffin was placed on a specially constructed wooden sled and pulled by oxen to Windsor Castle for burial. Once the coffin had been stripped bare, the remains were carried into the church and laid to rest in a vault beside the tomb of Henry's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, who had died giving birth to their son, the future King Edward VI. So while Henry VIII's spectacularly gory demise may have been an inconvenience for those burying him, it was actually a fitting end for such a larger-than-life and monstrously cruel king.